Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to start today with some good news. I think it's fantastic that the Golden State Warriors played an incredible basketball game last night and brought them to victory over the Rockets out of Texas, and are going to advance on to the next round of the basketball playoffs. So congrats to the Dubs. But sadly, that's where the good news ends. And what we're going to talk about for the rest of this evening is some bad news, bad for the American people. The Republican plan to extend the Trump tax cuts for the billionaire donors like Elon Musk's is a bad deal for the American people. During this special order, we're going to lay out exactly how reckless this Republican plan is to extend the Republican Trump tax cuts. An extension of the Republican Trump tax cuts would disproportionately benefit those who need it the least, would recklessly increase our nation's deficit, and it fails to prioritize hardworking Americans' contributions. Republican tax cuts get our priorities exactly backwards. When Democrats passed tax cuts, we focused on who needed the help the most. The tax cuts that Democrats passed and President Biden signed into law were some of the most significant middle-class tax cuts we've seen in a generation. In 2021, our expanded child tax credit nearly cut child poverty in our country in half. We also made historic expansions to both the earned income tax credit and the dependent care credit, which dramatically cut child poverty. In other words, when Democrats do tax cuts, we focus those cuts on those who need it the most. The Republicans, on the other hand, are looking to extend tax cuts that are overwhelmingly tilted to benefit those who need it the least. Under the Republican tax bill, a taxpayer who makes $1 million or more saw an average tax cut of $79,000, where a taxpayer making $50,000 only saw about $270 in tax cuts. Putting this another way, for every dollar they're giving to the average working person, they're handing $288 to a person making over $1 million every year. Let me be clear about that statistic. I'm not talking about a millionaire, not someone who is sitting on a house and a 401k that they've worked for and saved for 30 years to hit $1 million. This is what they're giving to someone who makes $1 million every year. Now, I don't know how you feel, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think people who are making $1 million a year are the ones that need a helping hand in this economy. Now, suffice it to say, we've made this point once or twice before, and every time we do, we get the same response from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. They say, people who make over $1 million pay a lot in taxes, so of course they get a bigger tax cut. But that argument's full of prunes. Let's be clear. Congress is perfectly capable of cutting taxes for working people without also cutting taxes for those at the top. That's right. Believe it or not, Mr. Speaker, you can lower the tax rates at the bottom without also lowering the tax rates at the top. In fact, last year, a Treasury Department did a study. They looked at how much it would cost to extend the Republican Trump tax cuts so that everyone making under $400,000 a year was held harmless. No impact on the bottom 98% of the income distribution. How much did it cost? They said it would cost $1.8 trillion. Now, that's not pocket change. We all know that. But it's a heck of a lot less than the recent Joint Committee on Taxation estimate of $4.6 trillion that it will cost to extend the Republican Trump tax cuts that favor those who don't need any help. The thing is, if Republicans would be willing to abandon their goal of cutting taxes for the most fortunate, if they would genuinely focus on the middle class and focus on offsetting those tax cuts in a responsible, deficit-neutral manner, I bet they could get a lot of colleagues on my side of the aisle to join them in that effort. But instead, they've embarked on a go-it-alone strategy. And go it alone they will, as long as their goal is to reward their big donors with massive tax cuts while leaving working people behind. They can go it alone. For someone who knows the impact that these tax cuts have had on taxpayers across our country, the negative impact they've had on working people across our country, someone who knows well how these Republican tax cuts stole from people who live in high-cost areas their ability to deduct their state and local taxes, costing constituents in those areas thousands and thousands of dollars a year. Someone who knows well what that is, and someone who's been working tirelessly ever since they did that, ever since they foisted that tax cut or that tax increase on people in high cost of living areas. Someone who's been working on it ever since they did it, trying to work with people on both sides of the aisle to figure out how to resolve the state and local tax deduction issue, is my colleague Tom Suozzi from New York, a great member, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and I'd like to yield to Mr. Suozzi.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it very much, and thanks so much for bringing the important attention to this issue. I'm going to talk about the state and local tax deduction in some detail, but first let me just say generally, what you're talking about is so important. We have so many of our friends on the other side of the aisle that are constantly talking about how the government spends too much money and deficits are getting so much bigger, and here under their tax bill that they're proposing right now, they're going to increase the deficits in the United States of America by $4.5 trillion. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they propose something when they have people on their side that their singular most important issue is reducing the deficit, that they would increase the deficit by $4.5 trillion? Now, you talked about the tax cuts from 2017. Well, a lot of my residents didn't see a tax deduction. They saw a tax increase. And the reason they saw a tax increase is because they capped the state and local tax deduction at $10,000. So let me just explain what the state and local tax deduction is. The state and local tax deduction was in place for 100 years, from 1913 until 2017. And in 1930, they started the federal income tax code in the United States of America. And when they said we're going to tax people's income at the federal level, a lot of governors and mayors and local elected officials said, no, we don't want a federal income tax because that will stop us from raising the taxes at the state and local level. Because since America's founding, government was mainly paid for at the state and local level through state and local taxes. The federal government was funded by tariffs, quite frankly, a very interesting topic for today. But when they protested, the mayors and governors protested, said, we don't want you to have a federal income tax because you're going to hurt us. We don't want to pay taxes on the taxes we've already paid at the state and local level. They said, nope, don't worry about it. We're going to put a deduction in place that says you can deduct your state and local taxes from your income so you don't have to pay taxes on the taxes you've already paid. Okay, let's do that. They put it in place for 100 years. In 2017, they said we're going to cap this deduction that's been in place for over 100 years, at $10,000. They took the long arm of the federal government and they reached into local governments. They violated the covenant of federalism, and they said, we're going to make you pay taxes on the taxes you've already paid to your states, to your cities, to your towns, to your villages, to your school districts. We're going to tax you on the money you've already paid in taxes at the state and local level. And that caused some people's taxes to go up, especially in high-tax states that happen to be Democratic states. In New York, in New Jersey, in California, in Connecticut, in Illinois, in Massachusetts, in Maryland, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Oregon, in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, in Rhode Island, in Hawaii. They caused people's taxes to go up because they could no longer deduct their state and local taxes. It's not fair. In fact, people have moved away from our states to other lower tax states. Now, why are taxes higher in my state and in your state compared to, say, Florida and Texas? Because in New York State and in California, we insure our children. We have the lowest rates of uninsured children in the United States of America. We have the lowest rates of uninsured adults in the United States of America, whereas Florida and Texas have the highest rates of uninsured children and uninsured adults. Our taxes are higher in our states because we pay our teachers and our police officers and our firefighters and our other public workers in public employee unions and other union workers higher wages. They don't like unions in Florida and Texas and other low-tax states. It's not fair that in our states, like mine and yours, Mike, and other Democratic states, that we are net donors to the federal government. We send more money to the federal government than we get back. I have a lot of our colleagues, they criticize our states. They say, oh, it's so ineffective the way you're running your states. Well, why is it we're doing so well economically that we are the biggest net donors to the federal government? We send more money to the federal government in income taxes than we get back in federal contracts and federal programs. In fact, most of the red states in the United States of America are net takers, and most of the blue states are net donors. So it's not fair. In our state, and it's very different from state to state in our country, but in my state, for example, in your state similarly, if you have a teacher and a police officer that are married, their income could be over $150,000, $200,000 a year. Now, if you're in our states, because the taxes are higher, because the cost of living is higher, the cost of housing is higher, that $150,000 to $200,000 a year is not a wealthy person. That's a middle-class person. Whereas in other states, like I've talked to a friend of mine from Oklahoma, I told him, well, this person's middle class, they're making $150,000 a year between the husband and wife. They said $150,000 a year, if you lived in my state, you'd be living in a gated community. You'd belong to the country club. That's not what it's like. It's different from place to place. But we set up these different state and city governments throughout our country to be laboratories of democracy, to run their states and their cities the way they saw fit, to tax them as they saw fit. And the one way that they used the federal income tax code to move forward was to have a state and local tax deduction that was ripped away from them in 2017. Now, some of my colleagues on the Republican side have said they will not support this new tax bill unless we restore the state and local tax deduction. Now, we'd like to see a complete repeal of the cap. We'd like to have you be able to claim all of your state and local taxes. We passed it 3 times when the Democrats were in charge. We passed it once, complete repeal, twice, complete repeal, third time, $80,000 cap. Some Republicans have proposed a cap of $25,000. 5 Republicans have stood up and said $25,000 is not acceptable. And I want to commend them for standing up for their residents and for their taxpayers against their party and saying they will not support this bill. President Trump came to my state, actually right near my district in Nassau County, where I used to be the county executive, and he spoke to a campaign rally in the summer of 2024, and he said, we got to restore the state and local tax deduction. Now, he's the one who took it away. But he says, we got to restore the state and local tax deduction. Well, let's hold the president to that. Let's commend our 5 colleagues that are standing up against their party to say they want to raise the state and local tax deduction. And let's be fair to these middle-class families. Let's be fair to these states. Let's be fair to these mayors and governors and county executive. Let's be fair to our firefighters and our teachers. Let's be fair to make sure that these states that are net donors to the federal government are treated with the proper respect and dignity that they deserved throughout America's history, and stop penalizing them for trying to serve their residents the best way they can. Thank you, Mike, and I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Tom, thank you very much for the passion you bring to this issue. I know how much work you've put into it, and I want to add a couple things on the SALT topic. One, as I think you remember, when this was happening, my subcommittee held hearings on SALT, and we brought witnesses in from a number of different states, not all blue states. Blue states are the ones that are generally recognized as being most harmed by this terrible tax policy that the Republicans put on us. But what we saw in those hearings were red states are quickly catching up. So this is catching red state taxpayers as well. And it's hurting them just like it's hurting taxpayers in blue states. And I just want to mention, you talked about our Republican colleagues who are talking a good game about how they won't vote for this, that, and the other thing unless SALT is taken care of. Well, SALT goes back to what it used to be if we don't do anything. So that's where we could end up if this foolish tax bill that is being pushed on the American people right now were to go away. We get our SALT deduction back. So I certainly hope that the colleagues that you mentioned are going to hold to their word and work with us to see if we can fix that. And you're spot on regarding donor states, like your state, like my state. We give more money to the federal government than we get back. And just to demonstrate how big that is, in my state of California, if you take all the money, if you deduct the money that we get back from the federal government from all the money that California taxpayers send to the federal government, what's left, what stays in Washington to go out to all the red states is more than the entire state budget of 47 other states.
Oh my gosh.
47 other states. So to say that that we represent donor states, that's almost a throwaway line. We're paying the freight for all the states that are voting in a way that is hurting the American taxpayer. It's unexcusable. And it's unexcusable that my Republican colleagues are looking to enact these tax cuts at the expense of the American people, including cutting up to $880 billion from Medicaid over the next 10 years. So nearly 1 in 4 American, or 80 million American people, are covered by Medicaid. These cuts that the Republicans are promoting mean that our neighbors will struggle to afford to see a doctor, they'll struggle to pay for medication, or they won't have access to nursing home services if they need it. For over 60 years, Medicaid has been a lifeline for people with low incomes and for people with disabilities so they could have access to health care. Already we're seeing rural hospitals struggling, not just in my district. Rural hospitals across the United States of America are struggling. Many of them are closing or they're eliminating critical services. These hospitals, every one of them, are heavily reliant on reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid. Any cut in Medicaid funding would lead to catastrophic results for all, not just those on Medicaid, for everyone. Those lacking coverage will skip necessary care, only making people sicker, requiring costlier treatment. It will put a strain on local emergency rooms and community health providers when these folks show up in the emergency room with a very, very serious problem that, as I said, will cost more to treat. In fact, every uninsured person results in a $900 uncompensated health care cost per year. This results in greater services being offered, higher prices for patients, and reduced investments in local health care centers. Cutting Medicaid will devastate the most vulnerable, 12 million people in rural areas, not rural areas in blue states, rural areas across the United States of America. 12 million people in those rural areas have health coverage through Medicaid, including 47% of children living in rural communities. It is, in many instances, the only way that kids can get health care. And 38% of children in urban areas also rely on Medicaid coverage. Yet these Medicaid and ensuing service cuts will just show new physicians that they can't count on keeping a job in a rural hospital. The Medicaid cuts will widen the gap between what a rural hospital can offer and what an urban or suburban hospital can offer. And it's not just those on Medicaid who will suffer. Without Medicaid reimbursement, hospitals, clinics, doctors' offices, urgent care centers, they'll close, leaving even those with private insurance without access to health care. In my state, a third of the population is covered by Medicaid. You can't cut a third of the money that goes to health care and expect our health care system and infrastructure to stand. Hospitals and clinics will close their doors. If they don't close, they'll cut services dramatically. So it doesn't matter if you're on Medicaid, if you're on Medicare, if you have private insurance through your employer, or you're filthy rich with pockets full of gold. If you go to the hospital, if you go to the clinic, if you go to an urgent care center, and they've had to make drastic cuts to compensate for these terrible Medicaid cuts that the Republicans are trying to push down their throat, there's not going to be anybody there to take care of you, no matter if you have the money or you have the insurance. If they cut services, your health care access will be truncated. There's no two ways about it. And it's been a very interesting exercise to watch our Republican colleagues, some of them, wrapping themselves into pretzels, claiming that, oh, I didn't vote for the Medicaid cuts. It was just an overall structure, giving direction of how we should cut these monies. And remember, cut these monies so they can give a tax cut to their billionaire Musk-like donors. Well, that's just not true. You can't vote for a structure that takes $880 billion out of the health care safety net and claim that you didn't do it. You voted that way. You voted to cut Medicaid, which will hurt everybody's health care delivery. And now we see it again. Now they're trying to create this balancing effort to suggest that they're not cutting Medicaid, they're just going to put in place some 7-bank shot procedure where the $880 billion is still at risk, but they can do it without voting to say that they actually cut Medicare. Medicaid. You just can't hide the ball. It doesn't matter what you call it. Your priority of tax cuts for the very rich, people who don't need the help, will cut health care for our constituents, for all of our constituents. And that's going to hurt every one of us. It doesn't matter if you're in an urban area, a rural area, a suburban area, a red state, a blue state, or whatever color state you think you live in. These cuts are devastating. I've had hospital administrators in my district tell me, if these go through, we're closing our hospital. I've had clinics tell me, our clinic is done if this goes through. It's mean, it's cruel, it doesn't have to happen, and it's going to hurt everyone. And I think it's important for the American people to know what the Senate is planning on doing in regard to this discussion. They're using what they call a current policy baseline. Remember that, current policy baseline. I don't care what finance classes you took. I don't care if you're the CFO in the biggest corporation in the world. This is not a policy definition that any of you have ever studied before. This is a new thing that they made up in order to justify what they're trying to do in regard to the tax cuts for people who don't need it. So they call a current policy baseline to measure the cost of the tax bill. Current policy baseline, according to them, is just a fancy word for we're not really doing what you say you're doing, but what it is, it's accounting fraud. Any way you cut it, it is accounting fraud. Here's what's going to happen. Republicans are going to pass massive tax cuts, with much of it going to those at the very top of the income scale, those who don't need our help. And the nonpartisan professional economists at the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office are going to provide a score. In other words, they're going to tell us how much it's going to cost to do what it is they want to do. They submit that information to all members of Congress, so we know what the cost of this tax cut policy will be. But with what the Senate is doing, the way they're setting up this score, the score that has been developed by experienced nonpartisan officials with PhDs over in economics who provide this good information to us, they're going to have to do some kind of maneuver to figure out how they deal with this new accounting fraud, and they're going to put all the good work and all the experience they have to the side, because the Republicans don't want you to see what the real score is. They don't want you to see the kind of reckless deficits that this bill is going to create. And Mr. Suozzi said it well. All the tax policy that we're talking about is not paid for. So all the pearl clutching that went on leading into the election, all the crying and screaming about the national debt, all of a sudden it doesn't matter. We're going to put, at a minimum, $4.6 trillion onto the national debt because of this. So what they do instead, they're going to make up their own score with this new accounting fraud that they've developed. And the Senate's made it clear what the score will say. It will say extending the Republican Trump tax cuts cost zero. It is pretending that the tax cuts are free. And tax cuts, the American people know good and well, are not free. There's a cost associated with those. The ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal, former chairman, described this magical thinking tax fraud accounting system that the Republican senators came up with in a recent editorial in the Washington Post. And I like his description. This is what he said. He said it's like paying for 3 family vacations, saving your money and paying for 3 family vacations, and then saying, now all of our future vacations are free. We don't have to save, we don't have to pay for them. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me assure you, let me assure the whole House, let me assure the American people, extending the Trump tax cuts is not free. In fact, we have a recent estimate from the Joint Committee on Taxation that says extending the Trump tax cuts costs $4.6 trillion. This is $4.6 trillion that will be added to the debt. Not only does extending the Republican Trump tax cuts cost an extra $4.6 trillion, but because they are pretending it's free and it doesn't cost anything and doesn't need to be offset, every last penny of those tax cuts will be borrowed money. Borrowed money isn't free either. Who's going to pick up the tab on this? Your kids, your grandkids, future generations are paying the freight for this irresponsible tax policy that's coming down the way. And on top of that, there's another $1.5 trillion in tax cuts that the Republicans want to add to that. So that's $6.1 billion of unpaid for tax cuts. $1.6 billion debt on our children and our grandchildren just to give a tax cut to the wealthiest people in this country, people who do not need our help. This is wrong, Mr. Speaker. We need to stand up. Our friends and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle need to stand up and need to show the courage that their voters placed in them to stand up and speak out against this.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to place a motion for adjournment in front of the House.
What is the motion?
If I don't, can I keep speaking?
Gentleman's time's expired.
Is there a motion?
I'm looking for 25, 30 hours. Can we do that?
If you wish.
Mr. Speaker, with great reluctance, I move that the House now be adjourned.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.